Alright, so on to statistics part 4. So in parts 2 and 3 we discussed these 5 different questions, and they involved 2 groups, right? And so there's actually another question. It's called the proportion-based question that also involves 2 groups. However, it's a bit different compared to the other types of questions, right? And that's what we're going to cover in this part. So what is a proportion-based question, right? So essentially it's simple. It just uses proportions instead of values, and these can come in either percentages, or it could come in like successes in certain samples, right? So just be wary of that. So you go back to this diagram, basically proportion questions do not use any of these formulas, alright? So if you ever come across percentages or sample successes, don't use these formulas, alright? So if we go back to subject 1, we actually already dealt with proportion questions. This is the 4th type of question that you would see in subject 1, and the only difference between the subject 1 and subject 4 proportion questions is that subject 1, you're only dealing with one group, alright? And so in subject 4, you'll be dealing with 2 groups, alright? So that's a big difference. So don't use any of the subject 1 formulas if you see 2 groups that involve proportions. The one, I guess, caveat or exception is that if the question only asks information about one group and comparing it to a proportion, then you would use these calculations. But obviously, I mean, you'll know depending on what the question asks, right? So how do we actually solve it? So this is the formula right here. You use the test of equal or given proportions, right? Or just a prop test. And it uses the z-statistic, and that's basically how you get the p-value for the lower-tailed, upper-tailed, and two-tailed. All right. And so if you're wondering what the x1 or n1 is, basically x1 is the group 1 successes, and n1 is the group 1 sample size. And then you obviously know what x2 and n2 is. Now, if you were to get, let's say, percentages and you don't get the successes, right? How would you find, x1 or x2, right? Well, basically, you just get your percentage. Let's say group 1 had a 20% success rate, then you would just, obviously, you know, 20% times n, and that's what your x1 will be, right? So, pretty simple. Okay. And then another extra little bit about this test is that you will get a x squared value for the test statistic, right? So what this means is that in most of the other tests, when you do them, you will just get the either z statistic or t statistic, right? But for the prop test, it's unique where you get an x squared value. So to find out what your actual z statistic is, you have to square root whatever the x squared value is, all right? And that also leads to another issue, is that if your z statistic is negative, right? Due to the x squared thing, it'll make it positive, all right? So if your question's asking what the z statistic is, first you square root the x squared value, and then also check to make sure if it's supposed to be negative or positive, right? And you can tell with your p-value and stuff like that. I will say there's also other ways of solving this, but I just prefer this method, all right? And then last little bit of information I'll give is that using just those formulas, you should be able to solve nearly every question in part 4. They mainly ask about confidence intervals and p-values and test statistics, right? There are some, well, actually there's one hard problem that I have in mind, but you should be able to solve it. You just might have to switch around a few values. But in the Friday review session, I'll cover that little question. But yeah, anyways, on to part 5.